For over 4,000 years, the pyramids have stood on the Giza plateau, like sentinels guarding something we've never quite understood. Millions of people have walked past them. Thousands of scholars have studied them. Countless theories have attempted to explain them. And yet, beneath all that attention, beneath all that certainty, there remains a fundamental mystery that nobody quite wants to acknowledge. The story we've been told is remarkably consistent. Armies of slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, dragged massive stone blocks across the sand using nothing but ropes and wooden sledges. They worked for decades under the desert sun, driven by whips and fear, moving 2-ton stones into perfect alignment through sheer determination and numbers. It's a narrative that feels complete. It answers the question. It lets us sleep at night knowing that ancient people, while impressive, operated within the limits we've always assumed they possessed. But here's where the story begins to fracture if you actually look at the evidence. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. Some weigh as little as 2 tons, others weigh as much as 80 tons. Each one was quarried with precision, transported sometimes across great distances, and positioned with such accuracy that you cannot slide a sheet of paper between many of them. The entire structure aligns with true north so precisely that modern compasses devices designed centuries after the pyramid was built look crude by comparison. The mathematical relationships encoded within its proportions contain pi, the golden ratio, and astronomical alignments that shouldn't exist in a structure built by people we assumed had limited mathematical understanding. Consider this. The pyramid contains more stone than all the cathedrals, temples, and mosques built across Europe in the last 1,000 years combined. We built those structures with modern tools, mathematical notation, and accumulated engineering knowledge. We had pulleys refined through centuries of use. We had steel that could hold tremendous weight. We had teams of engineers trained in universities that had been teaching structural science for generations. And even with all of that advantage, we didn't attempt to replicate what ancient Egypt did alone. Nobody asks the obvious question. If the conventional explanation is correct, why can't we do it now? This isn't about denying that the pyramids were built. They obviously were. The evidence is everywhere. The question is whether the explanation we've been given, slaves with copper tools and ropes, is actually sufficient to explain what we see, or whether something else, something we've overlooked or dismissed, played a role in their construction. The unsettling part isn't that we don't know the answer, it's that we've stopped asking the question at all. Somewhere along the way, the standard narrative became so established, so certain, that questioning it began to feel foolish. And that's where the real mystery begins. Not in ancient Egypt, but in ourselves, in how we hold knowledge, how we accept explanations, and how we dismiss anything that doesn't fit the story we've already decided is true. When most people think of the pyramids, they picture one structure, the Great Pyramid. That perfect, impossible triangle rising from the desert floor like a geometric dream carved into reality. It dominates the imagination so completely that everything else fades into background. But here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. The Giza plateau contains far more than just that singular masterpiece. And if you look at everything that's there, really look at it, without the filter of what you're supposed to believe, a very different story emerges. Start with the basics. The Pyramid of Khafre, which stands beside Khufu's monument, appears newer in several ways. The construction techniques are different. The materials show less weathering in places where you'd expect to see more. And yet, according to accepted chronology, Khafre came first. Then came Khufu, who supposedly refined the technique and achieved greater perfection. This should mean improvement. This should mean learning, progress, evolution. It should mean that each generation got better at what their predecessors attempted. Except it doesn't work that way. Look further, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The pyramids that came after these two masterpieces aren't better. They're demonstrably worse. Smaller, less precisely aligned, built with techniques that show less sophistication. Some were abandoned mid-construction, their stones half-cut, their chambers incomplete. If civilizations improve over time, if knowledge accumulates and capability expands, then why would Egypt's pyramid building get progressively worse? Why would the greatest achievements come first, at the beginning, when the civilization was supposedly less advanced? Then there's the Valley Temple. This structure sits near the Great Pyramid. built from limestone blocks so massive that later civilizations literally couldn't move them. They tried. There's archaeological evidence of attempts. They left the stones where they were because no amount of effort could shift them. But the real puzzle isn't the size, it's the precision. The limestone casing stones that once covered these pyramids fit together so perfectly that you couldn't slide a papyrus sheet between them. A papyrus sheet. Not a knife blade, not even paper as we know it. The ancient Egyptians were working to tolerances so tight that they exceed what we can easily achieve with modern tools. The tool marks on these stones tell their own story. They suggest precision instruments that shouldn't exist in the archaeological record. They suggest understanding of geometry and engineering that contradicts everything we're told about ancient capabilities. This is the landscape of evidence that rarely makes it into popular documentaries. Not because it's false, but because it doesn't fit the narrative. And when evidence doesn't fit the narrative, we have a choice. We can adjust the narrative, or we can stop looking at the evidence. For a very long time, we've chosen the latter. The ancient Egyptians left behind an enormous library of written records, papyri that survived the millennia, hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into stone, architectural notations that documented their plans, thousands of pages of information that should tell us exactly how they thought, what they knew, and how they approached their greatest achievements. And yet, when we read these documents, we interpret them through a very specific lens. A lens that assumes ancient people were fundamentally limited in their understanding. When Egyptian texts describe construction methods, we read them as charming attempts at explanation rather than technical documentation. The writer was doing his best, we assume, but lacking the scientific framework we possess. When hieroglyphic records describe astronomical observations, we categorize them as mythology rather than science. Surely they were describing their gods, not actual celestial phenomena. When the Egyptians recorded mathematical concepts through harmonic relationships and geometric proportions, we dismiss these as primitive attempts at what we now express through algebra. But what if we've been making a fundamental error? What if different doesn't mean inferior? What if the Egyptians were simply operating within a distinct framework of knowledge that we've systematically overlooked because it doesn't match our own? Consider this. The Egyptians had no symbol for zero. By our modern standards, this seems like a severe limitation. And yet they possessed sophisticated engineering mathematics. They thought about space and proportion through harmonic relationships, rather than algebraic equations. They recorded astronomical data with startling accuracy measurements that wouldn't be matched by Greek astronomers until centuries later. They created a system so elegant, so teachable, so communicable across generations, that it worked perfectly within their constraints. The translation problem runs deeper than language. It's conceptual. We read Egyptian documents as if they were failed attempts to do what we do, but they weren't trying to do what we do. They were solving their own problems within their own framework. A framework that produced the pyramids. A framework that encoded mathematical truth into stone. A framework that has outlasted every civilization that came after it. When we stop assuming they were limited, and start asking what they actually accomplished, the evidence shifts. Suddenly, the inscriptions read differently. The proportions make sense. The engineering solutions no longer seem like lucky accidents. They begin to look like what they actually were. The deliberate work of people who understood something we've largely forgotten how to see. There's a moment that arrives for most people when they first encounter the mathematical properties of the Great Pyramid. It's a quiet moment, usually. A moment when the casual curiosity transforms into something deeper. A moment when you realize that what you're looking at might not fit into the framework you've been given to understand it. The pyramid's perimeter, when divided by twice its height, yields pi. Not an approximation. Not a rough guess. The actual mathematical constant pi, accurate to several decimal places. A number that the ancient Greeks wouldn't formally recognize and name for thousands of years. A number that requires sophisticated mathematics to calculate. A number that shouldn't exist in a monument, built by people supposedly using copper tools and trial-and-error construction methods. This is where most people pause. This is where the cognitive dissonance begins. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its base corresponds precisely to the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. The internal chambers follow the golden ratio, that mysterious proportion that appears throughout nature, in seashells and sunflowers and human faces, yet somehow also appears in a structure built in ancient Egypt. The diagonal measurements align with geographical coordinates in ways that seem far too precise to be accidental. These aren't isolated curiosities. They're layered, interconnected mathematical relationships, all present simultaneously in the same structure. Now, skeptics have an answer. They say that if you measure anything enough times, if you compare enough ratios and alignments, patterns will eventually emerge. Statistically, they argue, coincidence becomes inevitable. Given enough data points, you'll find mathematical relationships whether they were intentional or not. It's a persuasive argument. It feels logical. It feels like it protects us from believing in things that seem impossible. But here's the problem with that argument. It requires us to believe something that's actually mathematically improbable. The probability of these specific relationships appearing together in the same structure, by pure chance, is vanishingly small. Infinitesimally small. We're not talking about unlikely. We're talking about the kind of probability that mathematicians describe as effectively impossible. If you flipped a coin and got heads 100 times in a row, you'd know something was wrong with the coin. This is that kind of improbable. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did the ancient Egyptians know these relationships existed? They didn't have calculators. They didn't have computers. They didn't have centuries of accumulated mathematical theory to draw from. And yet somehow, they encoded pi into a monument. They built the golden ratio into its chambers. They aligned it with mathematical truths that wouldn't be formally recognized for millennia. You could argue that they discovered these relationships through observation and experimentation, that through thousands of attempts, trial after trial, they stumbled upon proportions that produced these effects. It's possible. People are capable of remarkable pattern recognition. But that argument requires you to accept something equally improbable, that they would then preserve these discoveries in a permanent form without leaving any written record of how they did it, that they would encode mathematics into stone but never explain the mathematics in papyrus. The pyramid sits there, silent, containing mathematical truth in every proportion. And somewhere along the way, we stopped asking how it got there. Stand at the Great Pyramid and orient yourself toward the horizon. Look at the alignment of its sides. What you're observing is true north, with a precision so accurate that it makes modern navigation equipment look crude by comparison. A compass designed and refined through centuries of scientific advancement will drift, will deviate, will require constant adjustment. The pyramid, built 4,600 years ago, requires no adjustment. It simply points true north, as if the ancient builders possessed an understanding of magnetic orientation that we associate with modern science. But the precision doesn't end with direction. It extends upward. The pyramid's position on the Earth contains layers of significance that seem deliberately chosen, rather than accidental. The latitude of the Great Pyramid, 29.9792 degrees north, carries a number that should feel immediately familiar to anyone who understands physics. The speed of light, expressed in meters per second, is approximately 299,792 kilometers per second. The builders encoded the speed of light into the geographical coordinates of their monument, a measurement that wouldn't be calculated for nearly 5,000 years after the pyramid was constructed. A number that has no reason to appear in the latitude of a tomb, unless, of course, it wasn't meant to be a tomb at all. The Giza complex itself, when viewed from above, mirrors the constellation of Orion as it appeared in the sky during a specific ancient epoch, not as it appears now, as it appeared at a particular moment in history. This suggests astronomical knowledge of precession, that subtle drift of Earth's axis that takes thousands of years to complete a full cycle. Precession is so gradual, so difficult to perceive, that Western science didn't widely recognize it until centuries ago. Yet the alignment of the pyramids suggests the ancient Egyptians understood it. They understood it well enough to orient their most important structures according to where the stars had been, as if marking a moment in time. The air shafts within the pyramids point toward specific stars. The internal proportions echo celestial mathematics. The chambers seem positioned not for burial, but for astronomical observation and calculation. It's as though the entire structure functions as a three-dimensional map of cosmic truths. Not a tomb, not a monument to a pharaoh's ego. A communication device. A message written in stone about the nature of the universe. Some would call this mysticism, others would call it astronomy. The distinction often depends on whether we're willing to grant ancient peoples the capacity for sophisticated observational science. By examining the precision of these alignments, by calculating the probability that they emerged through random chance rather than deliberate design, we can evaluate what actually occurred. The evidence suggests intention. The evidence suggests knowledge. The evidence suggests that the pyramids were built by people who understood something fundamental about how the cosmos is organized and who cared enough to preserve that understanding in permanent form. The question isn't whether they built it. The question is why we stopped asking what they were trying to say. Before we ask how they built it, we must first ask how they designed it. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Construction is one skill. Design is another entirely. Design requires you to envision something that doesn't yet exist. It requires you to predict how massive objects will behave under their own weight. It requires you to calculate stress distributions and load paths through geometric relationships alone, without calculus, without computers, without any of the mathematical tools we consider essential for such work. The angle of the Great Pyramid's sides is 51.5 degrees. This wasn't chosen randomly. This wasn't selected because it looked aesthetically pleasing. This angle was calculated to optimize structural stability given the specific properties of limestone. When you apply force to stone at this angle, the weight distributes in ways that prevent catastrophic failure. The pyramid was designed by people who understood, whether they articulated it in modern terms or not, the principles of structural engineering. Look deeper into the internal architecture. The chambers are positioned with redundancy and careful weight distribution, features that would seem excessive if the builders weren't anticipating and actively solving for structural problems. There are relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Stone beams that distribute weight in ways that prevent the chamber below from being crushed under the immense pressure of everything above it. These aren't accidental features. They're solutions. They're evidence of someone thinking through the problem and implementing practical fixes before construction even began. The Egyptians didn't possess calculus. They couldn't write equations. But they possessed something equally powerful: sacred geometry, a system of proportion and harmonic relationship that allowed them to solve complex structural problems using nothing but squares and compass. Their mathematics operated through ratios rather than algebra, through geometric relationships rather than algebraic formulas. Yet the results were mathematically equivalent, a different language expressing the same truth. This system was elegant. More than elegant, it was teachable. It could be transmitted from master to apprentice without requiring written formulas or abstract notation. A skilled craftsman could learn the proportions, understand the relationships, and apply them to new problems. Knowledge didn't need to exist in papyri to survive. It existed in practice, in demonstration, in the accumulated experience of masters training students across generations. Understanding this approach means recognizing that ancient engineering wasn't inferior to modern engineering. It was different. It worked within constraints. It used tools available. Yet it achieved precision we struggle to replicate even with contemporary technology. By the time you finish examining the pyramid's internal structure, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. These monuments represent not primitive efforts that happened to succeed, but sophisticated solutions based on genuine structural understanding. The builders knew what they were doing, and they knew it so well that their work has survived longer than any structure built since. Ancient Egypt wasn't a monolith. It wasn't a single unified state with all knowledge centralized in one location, guarded by a single authority. Throughout the Nile Valley, stretching across hundreds of miles, temples functioned as something we might recognize today as universities. Centers of learning where systematic inquiry happened, where knowledge was preserved, refined, and transmitted across generations. The Temple of Thoth at Hermopolis, the Temple of Ptah at Memphis, the Temple of Horus at Edfu. These weren't primarily religious spaces in the way we understand religion today. They were research institutions, places where priests, and here's where the definition matters, weren't exclusively spiritual functionaries. Many were scholars, astronomers, engineers, mathematicians. The role of priest conferred status precisely because these individuals possessed technical knowledge that others didn't. They held the secrets of the cosmos. They understood the mechanics of the universe. They could predict celestial events. They could design monuments that would outlast empires. Inside these temples, there were libraries, papyri stored in cool, protected spaces, astronomical data accumulated across centuries, mathematical treatises that documented calculations and geometric principles, architectural notations that showed how to solve construction problems. The most advanced knowledge of the civilization was preserved in these spaces, carefully guarded, systematically organized. Apprenticeship systems operated within this structure. A young student would arrive at a temple and begin training under a master, not in classrooms as we imagine them, but through direct practice, watching, learning, doing, being corrected, repeating until the knowledge became intuitive. The most complex principles were taught only to those who had mastered the basics. There were levels of initiation, degrees of knowledge. Some secrets were shared only with those who had proven themselves worthy through years of study and dedication. The famous mathematical papyri that have survived the Rhine papyrus, the Moscow papyrus, represent textbooks from these institutions. Look at them, and you see progression. Problem sets that build in complexity. Explanations that assume foundational knowledge. Teaching methods. Systematic approaches to problem solving. This wasn't random knowledge. It wasn't scattered wisdom accumulated haphazardly. It was organized, pedagogical, designed to train minds in systematic thinking. Mathematical training was rigorous, progressive, demanding. Students learned geometry through practical application. They learned proportions by measuring. They learned how to solve architectural problems by working through increasingly difficult examples. By the time a student completed their training, they didn't just understand mathematics in the abstract. They could apply it. They could design structures. They could predict how stones would behave under load. They could engineer solutions to problems that hadn't been encountered before. These temple academies created the intellectual conditions for pyramid builders to flourish. They preserved knowledge across generations. They created a culture where precision mattered, where understanding the principles behind your work was valued, where passing knowledge to the next generation was considered sacred responsibility. This was the institutional framework that made the pyramids possible. Not armies of slaves working under whips, not miraculous inspiration. Systematic training, accumulated knowledge. Institutional memory that spanned centuries. A civilization that took its intellectual inheritance seriously enough to protect it, preserve it, and transmit it forward. Certain individuals in Egyptian society held specific titles that designated them as keepers of specialized knowledge. These weren't ceremonial titles. They were functional positions that carried real responsibility. The overseer of works, the master of the sacred geometry, the keeper of the astronomical records, the scribe of the house of life. These titles appear repeatedly across pharaonic records, and they indicate something crucial. Expertise was recognized. Expertise was valued. Expertise was institutionalized. These weren't scattered individuals working in isolation. They were part of a formal hierarchy, a structure that ensured knowledge transfer from one generation to the next. A master would train apprentices. Those apprentices would eventually become masters themselves. They would train their own students. A continuous chain of transmission. Knowledge flowing forward through time like a river. The most sensitive technical knowledge was guarded carefully. Precise measurement techniques. Specific construction methods. Certain mathematical relationships. These weren't public knowledge. They weren't written on temple walls for anyone to read. They existed within initiated circles, within groups of people who had proven themselves worthy of access. This wasn't mysticism exactly, though it might have resembled it superficially. It was security. It was competitive advantage. Egypt maintained technological superiority, partly through knowledge compartmentalization. If your competitors don't know your methods, they can't replicate your success. But this system had a vulnerability, a fatal flaw that would eventually lead to loss. When knowledge exists only in the minds of skilled practitioners, and those practitioners die without successors, the knowledge dies with them. When knowledge is deliberately restricted to initiated circles, and those circles are broken through conquest, through cultural disruption, through the simple passage of time and changing priorities, the knowledge vanishes. It's gone. Not recorded somewhere safe, not preserved in libraries that survived, simply absent. A gap in human understanding where something once existed. The pyramids represent the peak of this knowledge system, the highest achievement of this institutional framework. They're monuments to what was possible when knowledge was systematically preserved, when expertise was valued, when institutions existed, specifically to ensure that what was learned in one generation would be passed to the next. Understanding how these systems preserve expertise helps us understand not just why the pyramids were possible, but why they eventually became mysterious. Not because the knowledge was mystical, not because it was impossible to achieve, simply because it was systematically lost. The chains of transmission were broken. The initiated circles dispersed. The institutional memory faded. And what remained was stone, silent, perfect, mathematical stone. Speaking across centuries to people who no longer possessed the knowledge to fully understand what they were hearing, papyri rarely survive millennia. The Egyptian desert is dry, which helps. But even in ideal conditions, organic material deteriorates. Paper burns. Insects consume it. Time erodes it. Our sample of Egyptian written knowledge is fragmentary, incomplete, biased toward what happened to survive rather than what was actually created. The texts that do survive often focus on administrative matters, tax records, religious rituals, mathematical abstractions. The practical technical manuals, the step-by-step construction guides, the engineering specifications, the detailed architectural drawings, these are almost entirely absent from the archaeological record. If they existed in abundance, if pyramid builders documented their methods thoroughly, those documents have been lost. We're working with fragments, with inference, with reverse engineering. This creates a fundamental methodological problem. We're trying to understand how something was built by examining the finished product, without access to the blueprints or the construction manual. It's like trying to understand how to build an automobile by examining a finished car, without ever reading the design specifications or the manufacturing procedures. You can make educated guesses. You can infer principles from outcomes. But you're always working with incomplete information. Yet here's what's crucial. The absence of written manuals shouldn't be mistaken for absence of knowledge. The ancient Egyptians were human beings with human intelligence. They almost certainly documented their methods. They almost certainly kept records. Technical specifications existed. Construction procedures were written down. Instructions for apprentices were preserved. But those documents are gone now, lost to time, destroyed by fires or floods or the simple entropy of existence. Recognizing this limitation prevents us from overclaiming certainty. We can't definitively say how every aspect of pyramid construction worked because we don't have the original documentation. But we also can't claim that the knowledge never existed simply because the documentation hasn't survived. The pyramids themselves are evidence, the precision of their construction, the mathematical relationships embedded in their proportions, the astronomical alignments, these are all documentation. The pyramid is the manual, stone is the paper, mathematics is the language. By acknowledging clearly what will remain unknown, we avoid the temptation to construct false narratives that close questions prematurely. Some mysteries will persist. And in that space of honest uncertainty, we find room for genuine understanding. Walk into almost any museum with an Egyptian exhibit, and you'll encounter the same display. A copper chisel, worn smooth from use. A wooden sledge, weathered by sand and time. A length of rope, frayed at the edges. The placard invites you to imagine, this is how they did it. Slowly, methodically, one block at a time. Copper tools, chipping away at limestone. Wooden sledges dragging massive stones across sand. Rope and human effort. Nothing more. It's a pedagogically satisfying display. It feels complete. It offers an explanation that doesn't require us to believe in anything impossible. Ancient people worked hard. They were patient. They had time and manpower. Therefore, they accomplished remarkable things. The narrative is neat. The evidence is tangible. You can hold the copper chisel in your hand and feel connected to the ancient past. But the narrative glosses over serious complications that emerge the moment you start asking practical questions. Copper tools dull extraordinarily quickly against limestone. Not eventually. Quickly. After a few hours of work, the edge becomes too rounded to cut effectively. This means constant resharpening. Constant trips to metalworking workshops. Constant dedication of resources to tool maintenance rather than construction. The quantity of copper required to create enough tools for a pyramid-scale project tools that would need to be replaced and resharpened continuously across years of construction would have strained Egypt's resources significantly. Yet archaeological evidence of copper mines from this period doesn't suggest production at the scale the traditional narrative requires. The numbers don't add up. Additionally, copper tools leave characteristic marks on stone. Specific patterns. Specific signatures of how the metal interacts with limestone. When archaeologists examine the tool marks on pyramid blocks, they don't always match what copper produces. Sometimes they do. But other marks suggest different tools. Harder tools. Tools made from materials like diorite. Stone tools that could achieve cuts impossible with copper. Tools that leave different patterns on the limestone surface. This is where the complete toolkit becomes visible. Bronze tools were stronger than copper, but required tin, which Egypt had to import. Scarce. Expensive. Used selectively. Stone tools, harder stones like diorite, could achieve precision cuts that copper couldn't manage. Saw technology using abrasive sand could create precision cuts far more efficiently than point tools chipping away block by block. Water as a tool, channeled and pressurized, can split stone along natural fault lines. Fire applied and then cooled with water creates stress fractures that make stone easier to extract. The Egyptians had access to all these methods, yet discussion of them remains peripheral in most pyramid narratives. Mentioned briefly, if at all, as supplementary techniques rather than core methods. Why? Because they complicate the simple story. Because acknowledging them requires asking harder questions about what the Egyptians actually knew and what they were capable of achieving. By examining the complete toolkit, not just the copper chisel, but the full range of techniques and tools available, the work that seemed impossible within narrow parameters becomes manageable within expanded possibilities. A pyramid wasn't built with one type of tool and one type of method. It was built with multiple techniques deployed in sequence, each technique suited to specific tasks, each tool chosen because it was the most efficient solution for that particular problem. It's not a story about slaves dragging stones. It's a story about engineering, about problem solving, about people who understood their materials and knew how to use them effectively. There's an image that has persisted for centuries. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, whipped by cruel taskmasters, dragging massive blocks across the sand under the burning sun, working until they collapsed, replaced by fresh bodies. An endless stream of human suffering in service to one man's ego. It's a powerful image. It resonates emotionally. It fits narratives about power and cruelty that we're drawn to instinctively. The problem is that this image originated from a single source, a Greek historian named Herodotus, who visited Egypt centuries after the pyramids were built. He didn't witness pyramid construction. He heard stories. He recorded speculation. He documented rumors. That's all. Yet this speculation, this hearsay, this centuries-old gossip, has become the foundation of our entire understanding of how the pyramids were built. No Egyptian texts describe labor in these terms. No papyri document massive slave populations. No hieroglyphic records mention the brutality and suffering that supposedly characterize pyramid construction. The evidence simply isn't there. Yet we've been teaching Herodotus's speculation as historical fact for generations. We've built museums exhibits around it. We've written textbooks based on it. We've passed it to our children as settled knowledge. The archaeological record, when examined carefully, suggests something very different. Workers' villages have been discovered near pyramid sites, not slave camps. Villages with planned habitation, with infrastructure, with evidence of medical facilities, with organized food distribution. The layout suggests valued workers, people who were fed well, people whose health mattered, people who were cared for. This doesn't look like a slave camp. It looks like a major construction project with organized labor systems. The Great Pyramid probably took somewhere between 5 and 20 years to build. Estimates vary, depending on assumptions about labor efficiency and work schedules. But even at the upper end, this suggests a workforce of hundreds rather than hundreds of thousands. Skilled workers, organized teams, supervisors, support staff, seasonal laborers conscripted as taxation in service perhaps, but not permanent enslavement. The work was difficult, dangerous, demanding, but it was managed as a major civic project with systems and supply chains and organization, not as a horror spectacle. Once we adjust our assumptions about labor scale, other efficiencies become visible. Smaller, skilled teams working with multiple techniques and proper tools can accomplish remarkable results. 100 skilled workers are worth more than 1,000 untrained slaves. A team that understands what it's doing accomplishes more than a team that's simply following orders out of fear. The most efficient construction projects aren't the ones with the largest labor forces. They're the ones with the best organization and the most skilled workers. This reframing doesn't diminish the achievement. It elevates it. The pyramids weren't built through brute force and suffering. They were built through planning, through skill, through coordination. Through people who knew their craft and were valued for their knowledge. Getting a 2.5-ton limestone block from a quarry to its final position in the pyramid is a puzzle within a puzzle. It's the kind of practical problem that separates theoretical discussion from actual accomplishment. Understanding the mathematics is one thing. Actually moving stone is another entirely. Ropes alone face mathematical limitations. There's only so much weight a rope can bear. Only so much force human beings can generate by pulling. Even assuming extraordinary quantities of rope and extraordinary numbers of people, the physics becomes problematic. Rolling doesn't work efficiently on sandy terrain. Friction is high. Effort is wasted. Yet the evidence shows that stones were moved, often over considerable distances, and positioned with extraordinary precision. Multiple techniques likely worked in combination. Sledges that reduced friction between stone and sand, water-lubricated pathways that made sledges more efficient, lever systems that distributed weight strategically, ramp systems probably spiral rather than the straight massive ramps we often visualize, which would require more material than actually existed, possibly rotating or rolling mechanisms that haven't been fully reconstructed, perhaps even techniques we haven't considered yet. Quarry sites show evidence of organized extraction, suggesting standardized block sizes. Careful planning. Stones appear to have been selected for specific positions. Heavier stones positioned lower for stability. Lighter stones positioned higher to reduce structural stress on lower sections. This implies pre-planning and calculation, not random placement, not trial and error. Deliberate positioning based on understanding how weight distributes through a structure. Internal ramps within pyramids suggest that stones were moved upward through internal pathways, rather than entirely through external ramp systems. Some evidence suggests that wedge systems with differential friction coefficients could have been used for fine positioning, adjusting stones to precise alignment using simple mechanical principles. The goal here isn't to definitively answer how they did it. We can't know for certain without access to written construction manuals that haven't survived. But we can demonstrate that plausible methods exist. Methods that don't require impossible labor mobilization. Methods that don't require unknown technology. Methods that use principles available to ancient engineers and basic tools that archaeology has confirmed they possessed. Once you accept that multiple techniques could be combined, once you accept that expertise could optimize for efficiency, once you accept that planning could reduce wasted effort, the achievement becomes comprehensible. Not miraculous, not impossible. Engineering. Sophisticated, careful, methodical engineering. The kind of work that emerges when skilled people apply their intelligence to difficult problems and have the time and resources to solve them properly. The Great Pyramid represents the apex of a particular kind of ambition. A single, unified vision. A pharaoh's desire to create something that would outlast him. Outlast his entire dynasty. Outlast empires. Something so monumentally perfect that it would speak across millennia to people he would never meet. This wasn't a practical building. It wasn't a fortress or a palace or a temple designed for daily use. It was pure purpose, pure achievement, a monument to permanence itself. The pyramid that came after it was slightly smaller. The next one smaller still. Then the trajectory shifted. Some later pyramids are markedly less ambitious, less precisely constructed, built with techniques that show less sophistication than their predecessors. This physical record of diminishing scale tells a story, not one that requires interpretation. The story is written in stone. Some scholars attribute this decline to simple economic exhaustion. The projects became so expensive that later pharaohs couldn't or wouldn't commit the resources. The civilization had spent its treasury on monuments. Other explanations suggest that the symbolic value of the pyramid form itself changed. Earlier pharaohs pursued monumental legacy. They wanted to leave something that proved they had existed. Later rulers pursued different expressions of power, different ways of ensuring their immortality. Still others propose that practical knowledge about optimal construction efficiency peaked and then fragmented as centralized knowledge systems began to break apart. This section isn't meant to solve the puzzle of why pyramid building declined. It's meant to establish something more fundamental. Pyramids weren't inevitable expressions of Egyptian civilization. They weren't the natural result of a society reaching a certain level of development. They were specific artifacts of a specific historical moment. A moment when resources aligned, when knowledge converged, when cultural priority focused on this particular form of monument, when political stability allowed unprecedented projects to be conceived and completed without interruption. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, pyramid building had largely ceased. Resources were directed toward temples, toward fortifications, toward administrative buildings. Pharaohs sought immortality through different means. The form that had represented the ultimate achievement was abandoned in favor of alternatives. This wasn't a collapse. It wasn't a failure. It was a shift, a pivot. A civilization making different choices about what mattered and how to express power and permanence. Understanding this helps us appreciate that the pyramid era was finite. It had a beginning, it had a peak, it had an end. The conditions that made it possible didn't persist forever. When conditions changed, choices changed. When priorities shifted, resources flowed in different directions. This is how civilizations actually function. They adapt, they evolve. They pursue different goals as circumstances change and as what people value shifts across generations. As pyramid building declined, something remarkable happened. The knowledge frameworks that produced it didn't simply vanish. They transformed. They were redirected. They found new applications. Temples became the major focus of construction, and temple building required and preserved much of the same geometric knowledge that pyramids demanded. The same astronomical understanding. The same engineering capability. The Temple of Amun at Karnak represents extraordinary architectural and mathematical sophistication. Arguably, it required more careful planning than a pyramid, more complex structural solutions, more intricate design challenges. The difference wasn't in the level of knowledge required, it was in the form of expression. The knowledge was channeled into a different structure, a different purpose. Astronomical knowledge that had been encoded in pyramids was preserved and applied to temple design, to astronomical notation, to continued observation and recording of celestial phenomena. Engineering techniques adapted to different problems. The knowledge persisted. It just found different outlets. This pattern appears throughout history. The physicists who developed atomic weapons eventually became involved in nuclear power, in medical applications, in peaceful uses of the same fundamental knowledge. The engineers who designed railroad systems found applications in other infrastructure, different problems, same underlying principles. Knowledge doesn't disappear when the specific project that motivated it concludes. It redirects, it evolves, it finds new purpose. Egyptian knowledge seems to have followed this pattern. By the Roman period, much had been lost through cultural discontinuity and disruption. But during the transition from pyramid building to temple construction, knowledge was deliberately preserved, through redirected application, through continued teaching and apprenticeship, through the maintenance of temple academies that kept intellectual traditions alive, even as the form of expression changed. This prevents the false narrative of mysterious collapse. There's no sudden darkness, no inexplicable loss of capability. Instead, there's transformation, evolution. A civilization that maintained its intellectual heritage even as its priorities shifted, and as the monuments it chose to build changed shape. Understanding this also suggests something important about knowledge itself. Knowledge is fragile not because it's inherently weak, but because it requires constant maintenance. It requires institutional structures to preserve it. It requires teachers passing information to students. It requires that each generation choose to value what the previous generation created. When those conditions exist, knowledge survives. When they break down, when institutions dissolve, when teachers stop teaching, when a civilization stops valuing what came before, knowledge can vanish. Not because it was false, not because it was flawed, simply because no one is maintaining it anymore. Here we face a methodological question that cuts to the heart of how we understand the past. How do we distinguish between intentional encoding of sophisticated principles and coincidental alignment that our pattern-seeking minds have overlaid onto historical objects? The mathematical relationships in the Great Pyramid could theoretically be accidents. The probability involves numbers so small that they're difficult to comprehend, but theoretically, it's possible. If you measure enough things, compare enough ratios, examine enough angles, patterns will eventually emerge. It's statistically possible that we're simply seeing what we want to see, imposing order on randomness. Alternatively, these relationships might have emerged from practical problem solving without conscious mathematical articulation. Engineers employing proportional systems to create stability might have arrived at pi approximations without formally knowing pi. Astronomers refining their observations across centuries might have achieved celestial alignments through observational practice rather than explicit calculation. The mathematical relationships we discover now might be byproducts of practical work rather than intentional encoding. This section explores the middle ground between two extremes, between they deliberately encoded hidden knowledge and it's all coincidence. The most likely scenario appears to be that Egyptian builders possessed sophisticated practical knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. Knowledge they applied pragmatically to construction problems. These applications resulted in structures containing elegant mathematical relationships. Relationships they recognized and appreciated, even if they conceptualized them differently than we do. Intention existed, but not necessarily conscious theorization of abstract principles in the way moderns might formulate them. They knew what worked. They applied it systematically. The mathematics we later discover in their work are artifacts of that applied knowledge. The elegance we perceive is real, but it emerged from engineering practice rather than from abstract mathematical research conducted in isolation. This interpretive position avoids false choice between impossibility and accident. It places Egyptian achievement within the realm of sophisticated human engineering applied with remarkable consistency and skill. Not superhuman, not alien, not mystical. Simply the work of people who understood their craft deeply enough to encode that understanding into stone, into proportions, into alignments that would survive and communicate across time. The pyramid asks a question we still haven't fully answered. What happens when practical knowledge becomes so refined, so elegant, that it begins to resemble pure mathematics? Where is the boundary between engineering and science? Between craft and knowledge? Perhaps the ancient Egyptians existed in that space where the boundaries blur, where skilled practice becomes indistinguishable from theoretical understanding, where the question of whether they knew something formally becomes less important than the fact that they knew it deeply enough to build it into permanence. At some point in the 20th century, something shifted. The pyramid slave narrative crystallized. It transformed from a theory, one possible explanation among others, into established fact. Textbooks presented it as settled history. Museum plaques reinforced it. Teachers transmitted it to students with the certainty of someone reciting established truth. The narrative acquired weight, authority. The burden of institutional momentum. Questioning it began to feel foolish, not because the evidence supported it overwhelmingly, but because challenging consensus creates social friction. We're discouraged from appearing credulous if we doubt mainstream scholarship. but equally from appearing arrogant if we contradict it. There's a safe middle ground. Accept what you're told. Move forward. Don't complicate things. The narrative persisted, not because new evidence continuously supported it, but because once established, narratives acquire their own gravitational pull. They become self-reinforcing. Textbooks cite earlier textbooks. Citations reference other citations. The original source, Herodotus's speculation recorded centuries after pyramid construction, becomes increasingly distant from the contemporary claim. Eventually, the claim simply asserts itself. It becomes fact through repetition rather than through evidence. This section examines how historical certainty forms and crystallizes, how it becomes dogmatic. It's not through conspiracy or deliberate deception. It's through structural processes, institutional inertia. Narrative stability becomes valued because it allows textbooks to remain consistent across editions. It allows teachers to present settled knowledge without equivocation. It allows students to progress without perpetual uncertainty. But this stability comes at a cost. The suppression of legitimate questions, the treatment of provisional interpretations as certain conclusions. This isn't cynicism about scholarship. Most historians and archaeologists are thoughtful and rigorous. Rather, it's an examination of how even rigorous disciplines can crystallize interpretations into dogma through processes that have nothing to do with deliberate deception. Similar patterns appear throughout history, throughout science. Medical advice from 50 years ago seems obviously wrong now, but it seemed obvious then. Scientific consensus shifts gradually as anomalies accumulate and new frameworks emerge. The tragedy isn't that we had wrong ideas. It's that institutional structures discouraged the questioning that might have corrected them faster. The pyramid slave narrative took root in the 19th century, when archaeological thought operated within specific intellectual frameworks. It persisted through the 20th century because questioning it required career risk in academic institutions. By the 21st century, it had become so embedded in popular understanding that challenging it felt almost heretical. Not because of evidence, because of social conditioning. This isn't unique to pyramids. It's how knowledge functions across fields. Understanding this process within pyramid scholarship helps us recognize where similar crystallization might be occurring in contemporary knowledge claims. Where have we stopped asking questions because we decided we already knew the answers? Where have provisional interpretations become treated as certain facts? Where has institutional momentum replaced evidence as the foundation for belief? These questions extend far beyond ancient Egypt. They invite us to examine how we hold knowledge, how we defend it, how we resist evidence that contradicts what we've already decided is true. When the standard narrative feels inadequate, when the explanation seems to gloss over real puzzles, people naturally search for alternatives. Ancient astronaut theories, supernatural intervention, lost advanced technology. These explanations didn't emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a gap between what the mainstream narrative claimed and what the evidence seemed to suggest. If you believe the pyramids are impossible with standard tools and conventional labor forces, then you're left asking, so what actually happened? The alternative theories aren't ridiculous in origin. They're answers to real questions that mainstream scholarship was failing to address adequately. This is crucial to understand. The existence of alternative theories isn't evidence that people are credulous or irrational. It's evidence that the mainstream explanation is insufficient. This section explores how bad explanations create fertile ground for wild explanations. If the official story is slaves built it with copper tools, and that seems obviously inadequate when you examine the evidence, then aliens built it feels like a reasonable alternative by contrast. Not because aliens are plausible, but because the official story seems implausible. The alternative becomes attractive not because it's well supported, but because it's less obviously wrong than what you're being offered. The solution isn't to ridicule people who grasp at alternative theories. It's to provide better mainstream explanations. Explanations that address the genuine puzzles without requiring impossible circumstances. By examining Egyptian knowledge systems, by presenting practical engineering solutions, by offering realistic labor organization, we create an alternative. Not to slaves with copper tools, not to alien technology. An alternative grounded in evidence. An alternative that still credits ancient peoples with genuine sophistication. This section explains why alternative theories flourished, not because mainstream scholarship was correct, but too boring, but because mainstream scholarship was inadequate. The vacuum created by institutional inertia and oversimplification naturally attracts speculative theories. Fill that vacuum with rigorous evidence and sophisticated interpretation, and the need for alternatives diminishes. People don't crave mystery for its own sake. They crave understanding. When understanding is available, when someone offers a coherent explanation grounded in evidence, that's what people embrace. The mystery fades not because we've eliminated all questions, but because we've provided sufficient answers to satisfy genuine curiosity. Once the pyramid slave narrative became institutionalized, certain questions stopped being asked, not deliberately, not through any coordinated effort, simply through the natural consequence of institutional incentives and academic career structures. University departments stopped funding pyramid research that challenged consensus. Journals became less interested in pyramid articles that contradicted mainstream interpretation. The brightest minds were encouraged toward other research directions. Funding flowed elsewhere. Career advancement went to those who worked within established frameworks, rather than questioning them. Over time, the field became self-selecting. People who questioned the mainstream narrative risked their careers. So questioners moved into alternative fields, or into alternative communities, where skepticism was welcomed rather than professionally punished. This isn't conspiracy. It's not malice. It's structural. It's how institutions work. They reward conformity and punish dissent, often unintentionally. The result is that entire categories of questions stopped being asked at major institutions. How did they align structures so precisely? Why do mathematical relationships appear in the proportions? What knowledge systems enabled such remarkable planning? These aren't inherently mystical questions. They're straightforward scholarly inquiries. But once the narrative became settled, they seemed unnecessary. Questions looking for answers to problems that were already solved. The tragedy is that better scholarship might have emerged from sustained investigation of these questions. But the institutional structure discouraged it. Science thrives on questions. It atrophies when questions become heretical. This section encourages the audience to think about where, in their own contemporary world, questions have stopped being asked because institutions have decided they're already answered. Where is genuine inquiry being suppressed, not through force, but through incentive structures? Where are people discouraged from questioning not because their questions are invalid, but because asking them creates career risk? The pyramids are just one example, but they're a clear example. An invitation to examine how knowledge actually works, how institutions shape what gets studied, how consensus, once established, resists revision even in the face of evidence that suggests revision is warranted. These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical questions about how we understand our world and how we decide what's worth investigating. The pyramids themselves are a kind of text, not written in words, not inscribed with hieroglyphics or carved with explanations. The text is encoded in proportions, in angles, in positions, in the careful choices made about which materials to use and where to place them. Learning to read this text requires understanding that ancient peoples might communicate sophisticated ideas through spatial relationships and geometric harmony, rather than through written treatises or explicit statements. The Great Pyramid's interior represents a three-dimensional textbook. The chambers encode relationships. The passages carry meaning through their dimensions. The alignments point toward cosmic truths. This doesn't mean the pyramid is mystical or that we should read supernatural significance into it. Rather, it means recognizing that mathematical and astronomical knowledge could be embedded into physical form as a method of preservation and transmission. Future generations could encounter the pyramid and, through careful measurement and observation, reconstruct the knowledge it contained. This is sophisticated thinking. This is knowledge preservation in permanent form. A library written in stone that persists even when papyri burn, even when civilizations crumble. The pyramid communicates through its mathematics, through the relationships between its dimensions, through the way weight distributes through its chambers, through the precision of its construction. Someone arriving from the future, someone with different knowledge, different language, different cultural framework, could still read this message. The proportions would speak to them. The alignments would be visible. The mathematics would be universal. This approach to understanding the pyramid requires a shift in perspective. Stop treating it as a puzzle to solve. Stop treating it as a problem requiring explanation. Instead, treat it as a voice. An ancient voice speaking across millennia. What is it trying to tell us? What principles did its builders consider important enough to encode permanently? What message were they so committed to preserving that they invested years and resources and the concentrated effort of thousands of people to ensure it would survive? By learning to listen to what the pyramid itself says, rather than approaching it with preconceived theories or predetermined conclusions, we open ourselves to understanding ancient knowledge on its own terms. The pyramid stops being a mystery to solve and becomes a presence to honor. Its mathematical proportions are language. Its astronomical alignments are statements. Its structural geometry is argument. Understanding this transforms how we approach not just the pyramids, but all ancient works. They weren't failed attempts to do what we do. They were successful accomplishments of what they set out to do. The question isn't whether they succeeded. The question is, what were they trying to accomplish? We label pyramids as tombs. They did contain royal burials. Kings were placed inside. Treasures were stored within their chambers. By that definition, they're burial structures. Yet this categorization obscures something crucial. It reduces the pyramid to a single function when the evidence suggests multiple purposes operating simultaneously. A tomb is fundamentally a receptacle, a place to deposit the dead. Secure it. Protect it. Preserve the body and the treasures placed alongside it. But the pyramids contain chambers with specific acoustic properties, passages aligned to particular stars, proportions encoded with mathematical relationships. These features seem excessive for burial alone. You don't need precision mathematics to create a burial chamber. You don't need astronomical alignments to store a body. You don't need internal chambers positioned with such care to protect treasures. The pyramid could function as a tomb with far less complexity than what we actually observe. Yet complexity is precisely what we find. This suggests additional purposes. The pyramid functioned as a temple, perhaps, a place for ritual, a sacred space. It functioned as an observatory, a location for astronomical observation and calculation. The chambers provided specific acoustic properties that may have been important for ceremonial purposes. The alignments served practical functions, allowing priests to track celestial events and maintain astronomical records. The pyramid was a monument to the pharaoh, certainly, a declaration of power and permanence. But it was also a monument to principles, to knowledge, to understanding about how the cosmos is organized. This brings us to a crucial philosophical shift in how we understand pyramids. They might represent an ancient attempt at something resembling science itself, not in the modern sense with laboratories and peer review and published papers, but in the sense of careful observation of the natural world, systematic documentation of patterns, preservation of knowledge for future generations. The pharaohs and their builders were engaged in a long-term project. They were trying to preserve what they understood about mathematics, about astronomy, about geometry. They bet that by encoding this knowledge into stone, they could ensure its survival across centuries and millennia. They were making a statement about what matters, about what deserves permanence, about what's important enough to invest massive resources in preserving. Whether or not this interpretation is precisely what ancient builders consciously articulated, whether they thought in these terms or expressed themselves differently, it emerges from examining what they chose to record in the pyramid itself. They thought these things mattered. They thought the principles embedded in stone were worth preserving. They thought future people would want to know what they had learned, and the fact that we're still decoding messages from that stone 4,600 years later suggests they were right. Right about preservation, right about what endures, right about what matters. If we imagine ourselves as inheritors of the pyramid builders project, if we consider what they're attempting to communicate across the vast distance of time, a message emerges. It's a message that transcends language, that transcends culture, that speaks directly to something fundamental about human consciousness and human capability. The message is this: the universe operates according to principles that are discoverable, knowable, beautiful. Mathematics expresses these principles. Geometry encodes them in space. Astronomy maps them in the heavens, and human beings, through careful attention and systematic study, can understand them. This understanding is valuable. It's important. It's worth tremendous effort and resources to preserve it. This section draws the emotional and philosophical conclusion from everything examined so far. The pyramids are a message that says, reality is rational. The cosmos has structure. Human intelligence can comprehend it. That's a scientific worldview. Not expressed through our modern framework, but expressed nonetheless. A statement about the nature of reality made in stone. The builders believed that nature could be studied, that patterns could be discovered, that these patterns merited permanent preservation. By encoding their knowledge into physical form, they made a bet about the future. They bet that human minds would continue to exist, that those minds would be curious. That curiosity would drive people to ask what the pyramids meant. They were betting on us, on you, on the idea that someone, someday, would want to know what they knew. We are those inheritors. The message was preserved precisely long enough for us to receive it. Not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently. We can still read the mathematics. We can still observe the alignments. We can still perceive the intention behind the construction. This section concludes the documentary's intellectual arc by elevating the pyramid from historical curiosity to philosophical statement. It becomes a declaration about the nature of knowledge, about meaning, about what deserves preservation, about what human beings are capable of creating when we direct our intelligence toward meaningful goals. The pyramid asks a question that extends beyond ancient Egypt into our own lives. What will you do with your intelligence? What will you build that lasts? What knowledge do you believe is important enough to preserve permanently? The pyramids didn't emerge from vacuum. They're not isolated artifacts existing outside the flow of human history. They're part of a continuous thread. A thread that connects ancient Egypt to contemporary science. A thread that runs through every civilization that's attempted to understand how the world works. The mathematical principles embedded in the pyramids appear in Newton's physics. They appear in Einstein's relativity. They appear in contemporary quantum mechanics. Different frameworks express the same underlying truths. The astronomical observations the pyramids record are continuous with Galileo's telescopic discoveries, with modern astrophysics, with space exploration. The engineering principles they employ are ancestral to all structural engineering that followed. Every bridge, every building, every structure designed by modern engineers rests, in some sense, on foundations laid by people working in ancient Egypt. By understanding how ancient peoples conducted systematic inquiry, careful observation, pattern recognition, mathematical modeling, practical testing, we recognize our kinship with them. We're not their intellectual superiors, we're their inheritors. We're working with better tools. We're standing on accumulated knowledge they helped establish. We're continuing a project they began. This section traces the invisible thread connecting pyramid builders to contemporary scientists. When a modern engineer calculates structural loads, she's applying principles descended from the proportional reasoning that Egyptian architects employed. When an astronomer observes cosmic structure, she's continuing work that ancient astronomers began. When a mathematician explores geometric relationships, she's working in territory ancient mathematicians mapped. The names change, the methodologies evolve, the terminology transforms. But the fundamental activity remains identical, paying careful attention to how the world works, and recording patterns in systematic form. The pyramids represent an ancient moment when that activity reached remarkable sophistication. But they're not unique. They're extreme expressions of what humans have always done. We're curious creatures. We observe, we measure, we calculate, we try to understand. We pass what we learn to the next generation. This process, repeated across centuries and millennia, is what creates civilization. What creates science? What creates progress? Recognizing this continuity prevents us from dismissing ancient knowledge as primitive. It also prevents us from mythologizing it as superior. It was human knowledge, expressed through human intelligence, applied to observable reality. That's all. That's everything. We are the latest chapter in a story that began in ancient Egypt. A story that continues toward an unknown future. Each generation receives what came before. Each generation adds to it. Each generation passes it forward. The pyramids are milestone markers in that endless journey. Evidence that the journey has been happening for far longer than we usually acknowledge. Evidence that the commitment to understanding persists across time. The ancient Egyptians invested tremendous resources to create monuments that would preserve their understanding. They quarried stone. They organized labor. They devoted years of effort. They did all this because they believed that certain knowledge was important enough to preserve permanently. That certain truths deserved to outlast the people who discovered them. That the effort required to encode understanding into stone was justified by the permanence that stone provides. We've inherited their knowledge. We've enhanced it through technological advancement. We've accumulated unprecedented amounts of information. We understand more about how the universe works than any previous civilization. Yet we're in a strange position. We understand more, but we may be worse at preserving it. Our digital storage degrades. Files become unreadable when formats change. Servers fail or are shut down. Platforms disappear. Our knowledge is scattered across devices and databases and institutional archives with no guarantee of permanence. We encode our understanding in increasingly ephemeral forms, websites that vanish, social media that disappears, cloud storage that depends on companies that may not exist in 50 years. The pyramid's permanence, still standing after 4,600 years, still readable in its proportions and alignments, contrasts sharply with the fragility of contemporary information storage. This creates a paradox. We possess more knowledge than ever, yet we've invested less in its preservation. The Egyptians built monuments. We build servers that require constant maintenance and eventual replacement. The Egyptians carved into stone. We store information in formats that become obsolete. They took the long view. They thought in terms of millennia. We think in terms of quarterly updates and software versions. This section raises a question without demanding an answer. If we're to continue the thread that pyramid builders began, what forms should our knowledge monuments take? Should we return to physical durable media? Can digital storage be made robust enough? What information is crucial enough to merit pyramidian permanence? The question isn't merely practical, it's philosophical. What does our civilization believe is important enough to preserve? What message would we want future inhabitants of Earth to receive if they excavated our ruins? What would we want them to know about who we were and what we valued? The pyramids force us to confront these questions through the example of what enduring commitment to knowledge preservation looks like. They're asking us implicitly, are you serious enough about knowledge to invest in its permanence? What would you encode in permanent form if you had to choose? Every person watching this documentary inherits the pyramid as a kind of teacher. It teaches through its durability. That commitment matters. That intention endures. That when you care enough to do something right, that care persists across time. It teaches through its precision. That attention to detail and care in execution produce results that outlast casual effort. That the difference between good work and exceptional work compounds across centuries. It teaches through its astronomical alignments. That paying careful attention to the cosmos and understanding its patterns is worthwhile. That the universe invites our attention and rewards our observation. It teaches through its mathematical proportions. That elegance and rationality underlie the physical world. That beauty and precision often coincide. That when you understand the principles operating beneath the surface, you can create things that resonate across time. These aren't lessons about ancient Egypt specifically. These are lessons about how knowledge is built, how it's preserved, how it's transmitted. The pyramid teaches that human beings are capable of remarkable feats when we direct focused intelligence toward meaningful goals. It teaches that what we create can outlast us, that our work can communicate across time. That meaning can persist beyond individual lives. It teaches that reality has structure that we can understand, that caring about precision and clarity in understanding matters, that making things endure requires commitment and skill. Each person viewing takes what resonates with them. For some, it's inspiration about human capability. For others, it's motivation to engage more carefully with the world. For still others, it's simply appreciation for what previous generations achieved and determination not to diminish that legacy. The personal lessons are diverse, but they all emerge from careful attention to what the pyramid actually says. The pyramid isn't just a historical artifact. It's a mirror that reflects back something about who we are and what we value. It asks each person, what will you do with your intelligence? What will you build that lasts? What will you preserve? What do you believe is important enough to outlive you? Let's establish what evidence actually supports. Not speculation, not theory, not what we'd like to believe, what the evidence genuinely demonstrates. The ancient Egyptians possessed sophisticated understanding of mathematics. This isn't arguable. The surviving papyri demonstrate systematic approaches to calculation. The proportions of their monuments encode mathematical relationships. They understood geometry deeply enough to apply it to practical problems. They understood how to use proportions to solve architectural challenges. They possessed calculation systems that produced equivalent results to algebra without employing modern notation or frameworks. The ancient Egyptians possessed sophisticated understanding of astronomy. They tracked celestial movements. They recorded astronomical data with accuracy that wouldn't be matched for centuries. They understood enough about the cosmos to align their monuments with precision. They understood enough to predict celestial events. They observed carefully enough to notice patterns and relationships. They systematized their observations into usable knowledge. The ancient Egyptians possessed sophisticated understanding of engineering. They planned monuments on unprecedented scales and executed those plans with remarkable precision. They solved structural problems. They organized complex projects involving hundreds of skilled workers over extended periods. They developed techniques for moving massive stones. They created construction methods that worked effectively given the constraints they operated within. They organized complex projects. They preserved knowledge across generations through institutional structures, apprenticeships, and physical monuments. They coordinated effort. They planned carefully. They executed precisely. These are facts supported by physical evidence, mathematical analysis, and logical inference from available documents. This section refuses to speculate beyond what evidence supports, but it firmly establishes that the evidence supports remarkable Egyptian achievement. We can confidently say ancient Egyptians were brilliant engineers. We can confidently say they were patient astronomers. We can confidently say they were systematic mathematicians. That's extraordinary. That's impressive. That's sufficient. We cannot confidently say they understood physics as Newton articulated it. We cannot confidently say they possessed technology we've attributed to them. We cannot say they predicted gravitational waves. By establishing clear boundaries between evidence and speculation, we honor both rigorous scholarship and genuine Egyptian capability. We refuse to overclaim. We refuse to mythologize. We simply present what the evidence demonstrates. What solid ground is impressive enough without exaggeration. The evidence alone presents a picture of remarkable human achievement that doesn't require embellishment or fantasy to be compelling. Ancient Egyptians were sophisticated. They were capable. They were intelligent. They solved problems. They created monuments that have outlasted civilizations. They demonstrated human potential operating at an exceptionally high level. That's the evidence. That's what matters. That's what we can confidently assert. Some questions will never be definitively answered. We don't know what ancient pyramid builders consciously intended when they encoded specific mathematical proportions. We don't know if they understood the relationships we've discovered through analysis, or if those relationships emerged through intuitive proportion and practical testing without explicit mathematical consciousness. Did they deliberately set out to encode pi? Or did they arrive at pi approximations through proportional systems they understood intuitively but couldn't articulate in modern mathematical terms? We'll never know with certainty. We don't know the names of the architects and engineers who designed the pyramids. They were certainly brilliant individuals. Their work speaks across millennia, yet their names are lost. We don't know what their daily thoughts were about their work, whether they felt pride in what they created, whether they felt duty, whether they understood the magnitude of what they were accomplishing. We don't know what spiritual or philosophical frameworks contextualized their technical knowledge, whether they saw their work as sacred, whether they viewed mathematics as divine, whether they conceptualized their achievements the way we do. We don't know how knowledge was transmitted between generations in precise detail. We'll never have transcripts of their conversations. We'll never read records of their debates. We'll never access documentation of their reasoning. The papyri that would answer these questions are mostly lost to time. Some may have survived in conditions we haven't excavated yet, but most are gone. This section sits with the mystery that will remain despite our best efforts. Rather than treating this unknowing as failure, we can recognize it as reality. The past is partially inaccessible. We can reconstruct much. We cannot reconstruct everything. Accepting this limitation prevents false certainty. It honors the genuine distance between us and antiquity. It protects us from filling gaps with speculation that feels like fact. By acknowledging clearly what will remain unknown, we avoid the temptation to construct false narratives that close questions prematurely. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. The pyramid will always retain a degree of opacity, and that opacity is part of its power. It ensures that future generations will continue asking questions. It ensures that the conversation between past and present continues. It prevents the kind of false closure that comes when we decide we've explained everything. Some doors should remain partially open. Some questions should continue to invite inquiry. The pyramid teaches us this too. The pyramids will continue to stand for thousands of more years if environmental conditions remain stable and human activity doesn't destroy them. They've survived 4.5 millennia. They've weathered storms and earthquakes and the erosion of time. They'll likely continue standing as long as stone itself endures. And as they stand, they'll continue to invite wonder. They'll continue to generate speculation. They'll continue to be studied. New technologies will enable measurements and analysis impossible today. Satellite imagery will reveal patterns we haven't yet perceived. Ground-penetrating radar will map interior structures we've never seen. Materials analysis will tell us about composition and degradation. Technologies not yet invented will discover things we haven't imagined. Future archaeologists will reinterpret current understanding. They'll challenge our conclusions. They'll propose new frameworks. What we believe now will be supplemented, refined, and partially contradicted by future discovery. This is how knowledge progresses, not through reaching final answers, not through achieving perfect understanding, through continuous refinement, through successive approximations of truth, through generations of people building on what came before, correcting what was wrong, expanding what was incomplete, asking new questions that previous generations never imagined. The pyramid guarantees that this conversation will continue. Each generation will ask new questions and receive partial answers that will drive the next generation to ask still newer questions. This is the permanent legacy of the pyramid. It's not a puzzle awaiting final solution. It's a conversation partner across time. It's a persistent challenge to human understanding that refuses to be fully solved or dismissed. Future civilizations will find in the pyramids what they're capable of understanding at their level of development. They'll remain tantalized by mysteries their development hasn't equipped them to resolve. They'll marvel at the achievement. They'll debate the methods. They'll ask how it was done. They'll generate new theories. And perhaps, with time and technology, they'll answer questions we can't currently address. The pyramid's greatest achievement isn't mathematical or astronomical. It's this. It ensures that the human project of understanding continues and remains connected across millennia. It links us to the past. It will link future peoples to us. It's a monument not just to ancient capability, but to the ongoing human commitment to knowing, to understanding, to asking questions and seeking answers, to taking seriously the pursuit of truth. Imagine standing before the Great Pyramid as the sun rises. The light hits the stone and reveals textures, proportions, surfaces. 2,300,000 blocks arranged with such precision that your fingernail wouldn't fit between many of them. Each block weighing tons. Each block positioned exactly where it was meant to go. Each block part of a structure that rises like a mathematical dream, carved into reality. Consider the scale of this work. Years of construction, thousands of coordinated workers, thousands of decisions made correctly, thousands of problems solved, resources consumed, effort expended, energy directed toward a single purpose, a monument, a declaration, a message sent across time, a structure that took years to build and centuries to surpass in height. A structure that required the finest engineering minds, the most dedicated workers, the most careful planning. A monument to one individual's power and vision. A preservation device designed to outlast empires and serve as a calling card across time. Yet standing before it, you confront a paradox. The pyramid is incomplete as a message. It teaches through its form and mathematical relationships, but it doesn't tell you directly what its builders intended. You're forced to interpret, to reason backward from evidence, to imagine what ancient minds held when they conceived these proportions. What did they believe? What did they know? What were they trying to communicate? This creates a peculiar state, absolute certainty about the physical fact. The pyramid exists. You can touch it, measure it, walk around it. The stones are real. The precision is real. The achievement is undeniable, yet interpretive ambiguity persists, about meaning, about intention, about the precise knowledge that enabled its construction. Standing before this contradiction, you must decide how to hold knowledge that's simultaneously solid and mysterious. This is where something shifts, where genuine engagement with the past becomes possible. The pyramid stops being a mystery to solve and becomes a presence to honor. You can understand the math, you can understand the engineering, you can understand the history, but nothing quite prepares you for the moment you stand before it and realize, I don't fully know how they did this, and that not knowing is exactly the point. This section describes the experience of encountering the pyramid as an embodied encounter rather than purely intellectual exercise. The documentary has been analysis, reasoning, investigation, but the pyramid itself is presence, weight and scale and permanence that intellectual understanding doesn't fully capture. This section invites the audience to imagine the encounter, to feel the vertigo of uncertainty combined with admiration, to experience the productive tension between what we know and what we don't. It's at this point of standing before the impossible, not that the pyramid is literally impossible, but that it represents the limits of understanding that transformation becomes possible. To inherit something means to receive it, and receiving something carries implicit responsibility. You must decide what to do with what you've received, how to treat it, how to preserve it, how to pass it forward. We inherit the pyramids as evidence of ancient capability, as proof that human beings, when they focus their intelligence and effort, can accomplish extraordinary things. We inherit it as inspiration for human potential, as demonstration that civilizations far removed from us could create monuments that we still struggle to explain. We inherit it as challenge to contemporary consciousness, as question about what we're doing with our own capabilities. The pyramids say, you have minds, you have knowledge, you have resources. What will you do with them? Will you build monuments that last? Will you pursue understanding? Will you preserve knowledge for future generations? Will you create beauty? Will you coordinate at massive scale for meaningful purpose? The pyramids demand that we be worthy of what we've inherited. They're asking, are you as committed to understanding and creating as the ancients were? Are you using your advantages or squandering them? These questions don't require that we build pyramids. They require that we ask ourselves what contemporary equivalents to pyramid building might be. What projects demand sustained commitment? What knowledge is important enough to devote resources to preserving? What would future generations need from us? What message would we want future peoples to receive about who we were and what we valued? The pyramid is demanding engagement, not imitation. It's asking each person, what is your pyramid? What will you build or discover or preserve that extends beyond your individual life? What will you create that matters? What understanding will you pursue? What knowledge will you safeguard? This section positions the documentary as more than explanation of the past. It's issuing a challenge to the present. The audience leaves not just informed, but charged with responsibility. The pyramid becomes a mirror for examining our own choices and priorities. It asks us to consider whether we're living up to the legacy we've inherited, whether we're taking seriously the pursuit of knowledge, whether we're preserving what matters, whether we're building anything that will outlast us. The pyramid was built one block at a time, not all at once, not through magic or supernatural intervention. One stone, then another, then another. millions of them positioned carefully over years of sustained effort. The knowledge that enabled it was accumulated one observation at a time, one measurement, one calculation, one realization about how something works. The understanding that reaches us across 4,600 years was preserved through countless individual choices. To record, to teach, to maintain, to pass forward, the ancient world changed through the accumulation of individual acts of intention and care, not through grand gestures, not through revolution, through people choosing, day after day, to think carefully, to work precisely, to preserve what mattered, to teach others, to value knowledge enough to safeguard it. Our world will similarly change, not through impossible grand projects, but through everyday choices, individual decisions to pay attention, to pursue understanding, to preserve what seems valuable, to teach others what we know. These are available to everyone. These are the actual continuation of the Pyramid Builders project. The first step isn't to build a pyramid, it's to begin noticing the world carefully, to observe what's actually present rather than accepting received explanations without examination, to ask questions even when answers aren't immediately available, to care about precision and clarity in understanding, to preserve knowledge that seems valuable in whatever form is possible, to teach others, to maintain the chain of transmission that connects past to future. This section brings the documentary's vast themes into the realm of individual possibility. It's not concluding with unanswerable mystery or impossible grandeur. It's concluding by suggesting that pyramid building in the contemporary sense is possible for anyone willing to bring intention and care to their engagement with the world. The documentary ends not at the pyramid, but in the consciousness of the viewer, positioned now to begin their own version of the ancient project, paying attention, understanding, preserving what matters, contributing to the ongoing human endeavor that the pyramids represent. One choice, then another, building something that lasts.